and welcome back to the Parable Podcast. I'm Danielle Zapchenk. You guys are in for a treat today with Jess Ledwell. She was a true delight to talk with. She shared about a dark time of transition that her and her husband went through. However, she encourages us with so much wisdom.
Anytime anybody starts something new, there is a dry space in between commission and completion, and that is called the desert. It happens to every single person, and if you define it, then you feel like it's not like, what am I doing wrong? I'm taking tiny steps and I'm gonna give up now. Because here's what happens. You're walking through a desert. If you do not have a focal point on the other side of the desert, you're gonna end up walking in circles.
Here's my conversation with Jess Ledwell. Well, Jess Ledwell, thank you so much for joining the Parable Podcast today. You are a writer, a poet, and a preacher of the gospel. Jess, tell me about yourself. Imagine yourself as like 7 years old. What were you like as a kid?
Gosh, at 7 years old, my son is 7, and he's that weird kid now. And I'm like, oh, honey, it gets better. Like so dramatic, and like would go and read books and trees and be out in the wild with, my dingle hopper. And I thought mermaids existed, and I would go on hunts for unicorns. And yeah, like I built my own bridge to Terabithia. I was that kid. I was the manic pixie dream girl.
Oh my gosh. I love kids like that. I had the joy of chaperoning our junior high school lock-in this last weekend all night. And it was just so great to see like the different kinds of personalities. Like this kid, he like wore sunglasses all night long. And I was like, do you, man, do you. So.
Live your best life. I love that.
Well, from that child at 7, in trees reading a book, obviously you loved reading. So when you say that you're a poet and you're a writer, has that always been like a part of you?
Yes, 100%. And it's weird because like where I got my start in fairy tales and beautiful stories of adventure, it kind of bled into my love of scripture and those beautiful love stories and stories of adventure and life change and the epic narrative of scripture, and all of that has just, because I just remembered at 7, one of my favorite stories of me as a 7-year-old, second grade, I was sitting on my bed looking out my window, and as audibly as you could hear God, it says a 7-year-old, he said, "Get ready, tomorrow you're going to tell all your friends about Jesus." And again, in this like, I'm a part of this epic story of the Lord. And I'm like, absolute. So I went on the playground the next day and I witnessed to 9 of my friends, and they went and did the prayer with me and everything. And I was like, sometimes I miss that little girl. She was great. But yeah, so like being a part of an epic story and being a part of God's story is just, it's something that's always been dear to my heart.
Jess, so obviously Jesus was a part of your life at 7. Did you grow up in the church? Was that normal every Sunday?
Kind of, sort of. I had a pretty rough childhood. We were shoe grew broke, is what I like to call it. You didn't get new shoes when it was time for school. Mom would glue your shoes back together with shoe goo. That exists. And so we went when we could. My mother was a devout believer. My father was not, and it was a tough time growing up. My father was an alcoholic, verbally abusive, sometimes physically abusive. And so we struggled growing up. So the idea of being a part of a story that was grander than the one that I was living was the allure for me. And it was a story that brought me to Jesus. Preschool, Sunday school with the flannel graph, whole 9 yards. And it was about like a mother hen who like the barn burnt down, but when the farmer came through, like he found the chicks under the mother hen and she had sacrificed her life for the baby chicks. Now, understanding a mother who was willing to sacrifice everything for her kids. Now, I understood that story. So stories have always drawn me closer to Christ, whether they were in scripture or even ones that weren't about, it was about a chicken, but it was what drew me in. And so a lot of what I have and what I've done has been because of God's grace. It hasn't been because I was born into any kind of luxury or privilege. It was because I knew Jesus and was blessed by Jesus, and I totally give him credit for that.
That's so beautiful. Again, this is all about stories. Jess, what would you like to share with us today?
So what I would love to share with you guys about is what my husband and I have very lovingly called the dark place. And so giving you a little bit of background, I didn't grow up in a really affluent area. My husband and I got married. We were both broke. I was a teacher at the time in North Carolina, which the teachers in North Carolina they're national news for not getting paid very much. My husband was a youth pastor and children's pastor, so he wouldn't get paid a lot either. So we were just, living the newlywed dream of you living on ramen and rice and beans. And so, but we loved it. We loved every minute of it. And everything we had was, that bootstrap idea and the American dream idea of the life arc of you go to school and then you meet the love of your life, and then you have your 2.5 kids and a dog, and you live in a little house with the fence. We even had the house with the fence, and he was in ministry and I was a teacher. It was beautiful. It was a great life. And we had our 2 kids. I had quit my teaching job and was getting more into the ministry side of it. So we were partners in ministry, and it was beautiful, and we were having the best time, and it was great. And we were part of this mission church that was doing great things in the community, and we were all in and full in culture and full in with the church. And then the church made a mistake and treated me and my husband very poorly and gave us an ultimatum. And the ultimatum was, you can take a pay cut and step down from the position that you're in, because somebody that they had hired was threatened by my husband's success, and we couldn't do that. We were already living below the poverty line, struggling, but we loved it. We loved the struggle, and so we left very graciously. Love the people at that church, love the church. Since then, and I always love to say this because there's been redemption in this story, but the pastor has called my husband and said he was sorry, that it was wrong. He asked him to come back. The other pastor who was threatened by him called him, apologized, said that it was wrong. So we left very graciously, have on great terms with that church. But what ensued after that was what we call the dark place.
Just before you go into the dark place, a lot of people, when they experience church hurt, and I'm sorry for that, because it's like what you're saying, you were all in, you were all for it. And then all of a sudden there's this human nature that comes into play that you guys weren't expecting. And everything is completely shifted, because I know for me and my husband, we are fully invested in our church. So if anything like that happened, it's like my arm would be cut off.
Your friend group, your community, your family. We moved to that church 2 states away from any family. They were our only family. When I tell you that they're the ones that threw me my baby showers, they're the ones that brought me meals when I was in the hospital with my second child. They're where our money went. They were everything to us. And we both were serving and working there. So it was our lives, our friends were there. It was crazy. So when something like that happens, it's like you said, it's the end of the world for you. And all of a sudden I realized that the life arc that we aspire to doesn't exist, where you get your job and you're married with your 2.5 kids, and then you retire from said job and live happily ever after in a beach in Florida. That doesn't exist. And I don't think it ever did. And I don't know why I was so delusioned to think that it did exist for anybody. And so that's when we ushered into the dark place.
So tell me, how long did this dark place last, or is this still something that you're coming out of?
So the dark place lasted for a full 1.5 years for us. In that dark place, there was a lot of lost purpose. There was a lot of grieving. There was a lot of physical recuperation, because physically we were exhausted from everything that we had given to this organization. And so there was a lot of grieving. There was a lot of resting. But then for my husband, it was a lot of, okay, so how do I continue on in ministry with knowing that this is a possibility, and how do I prepare myself just in case this happens again? But at the same time, I don't want to live my life like the other shoe's about to drop. And so that was for my husband. For me, I had 2 children under 2. And so I was dealing still with a little bit of postpartum. I was not sleeping because I had 2 kids under 2. I had lost my connections with my church community. And so therefore my mom community, it was a rough go. And so we like to call that place the dark place, because I was like, the only question we had then was, well, now what do we do? Like, our marriage was different. The way we were parenting was different. Everything was different. And we found another job and went to work in another church, but everything was different. And I will say that some of those people at that the next church, just open arms. That was probably one of the most sweetest times in that dark place that I ever experienced, was how sweet humanity is and how kind humanity can be when you're going through a dark place. And so I feel like a lot of times when I see other people going through dark place, I strive to be that sweet, safe place for them, because we found that. It didn't make it any less dark, but we found that. So it lasted a good year and a half.
Before you had found that church community, did you think like, I don't know if church is for me? Because I think there's this confusion of like, when we have experienced church hurt, we kind of push that onto Jesus, when really it's the humans, the sinfulness nature that's really the issue. So did you guys feel like, oh my gosh, like I don't even know if I want to go back?
Well, and I do agree that it's humanity and it's sinfulness that's the issue, but it's also some systematic problems that a lot of churches have that are causing some of these issues. And so the dark place was actually at a church that we actually left within a year because of some of those systematic issues. And so, yes, to this day, I still ask those questions, but I think it's good. I think it's good to ask those questions, because I think it's what challenges us as ministry leaders. Mike, my husband, is a family pastor now at a church in Georgia. We came back to Georgia. We can't stay away. We love Georgia. And I think that's one of the things that we learned from our dark place, is that there are things that we have to question and we have to challenge in order to make ourselves better, so that we make sure that we treat people who are going through their dark places well in church circles. Because there are people that are coming to our churches who have left other churches due to church hurt. Before, we thought that all of our relationships had to be in the church as ministry leaders. But now, just as importantly, is our relationships outside the church, so that they can see Jesus. And so, yeah, we have those questions all the time. Like, are we really doing this? Are we still really doing this? We're still really doing this. But I think those questions are good, because it's what makes us better and what makes us continue to try to be better for the capital C church.
If you were able to give some advice to somebody who's kind of in that transition state, what would you say to them?
So I was in the dark place for about a year and a half. There was a lot of depression, a lot of anxiety. There were a lot of side effects to what had happened to us. And so I stayed in that dark place, even when we transitioned back to Georgia, even though when we found a church that was great. My husband got a new job. I'm still over here going, well, what do I do? And so that was a question that just kept going, like, what do I do now? Well, what do I do now? I have all these gifts and talents that are really great. And like, how do I use them for the Lord? Like, I don't understand. What do I do now? And so that's when I met Deborah. Met's a funny word, because she's a prophetess and a judge in Judges 4 and 5. Oh, but I met Deborah. And so, little backstory of Deborah, prophetess and judge for Israel. They had just gotten into the promised land. They're in battles all over the place. They have peace and they don't have peace, and they have peace and they don't have peace. And so they were being attacked by the Canaanites, and this military leader, Barak, was supposed to be taking care of the situation, but he wasn't. And so Deborah calls him in and says, hey, why aren't you doing what you're supposed to do? And he goes, fine, but you better come with me. And she goes, okay. So she goes with him on the battlefield, and they're in the battlefield, set up perfectly. God sets them up perfectly for success. She said, don't worry, God goes before you. He's got this all handled. But then the morning of the battle, she goes into his tent and she's like, hey, today's the day. You need to get up and you need to go and do what God has told you to do. And so he's like, fine. So he goes, he wins the battle, of course, but he did not get the general of the other army. He did not get the major win, which was capturing and taking care of the general of the other army. So the general of the other army runs into the hills. He gets into a tent of a woman named Jael, and she gives him some food and he falls asleep. She takes takes a temp peg and hammers his head to the ground. Like, it's the most amazing story ever. And I had never heard it preached. And like, why does nobody talk about this story? Because it's phenomenal. And while I would love to say, oh, I am the Deborah of this story, and I am going to go and I'm going to do amazing things, or I'm the JL of this story, I'm going to rise to the occasion regardless of what I have in my hands to use to take care of this mighty enemy. Oh no, I'm Barack. Like 100%. Because I was in the dark place and I was scared and I was depressed and I didn't want to face what God had been asking me, calling me, wanting me, prepared me, had equipped me already to do. And I was like, no, I don't want to. And I was Brock, and God had been trying to wake me up for years. And so when I finally met Deborah, I was like, okay, I realized something. Taking charge of my mornings was weirdly equated to taking charge of my life. And so I started this thing called Finding Morning Glory. It started off as an Instagram project. And so what I did is I'm the world's worst morning person. I hate it. So I did a new morning routine every month, and I would report back Instagram lives and videos and IGTVs about like what was working, what doesn't work. And through that, I learned lessons about life and about transition. And I realized when I was working on all of these different morning routines, the things that I was learning about my mornings were things that would help me transition when I got to the point where I was asking myself, well, now what do I do? So here's what I learned. When you're going through the dawn of a new season, when you're in a place that's dark, but you know that you're transitioning into something new, the first thing you have to do is grieve the day before. So when I was preparing my morning routines the night before, there were things that I had to let go of in the past day before I could grieve and then start a new morning. So I realized in that dark place wasn't wasted because I spent a lot of time grieving. And if I had known that's what I was doing, I wouldn't have felt so dark. I would have had more hope in that dark place if I knew that I needed that time to grieve. I needed to grieve the relationships that I lost. I needed to grieve the community that I lost. I needed to grieve the bubble of my life that I had created that I hoped would exist that was popped. I needed to grieve that popped bubble. And so that was the first thing that I learned when I was preparing my morning routines, that I needed to grieve what had happened before. So like when I was preparing my morning routine, I would take some time to pray and forgive my kids, forgive my husband, forgive myself. Ask for forgiveness from my kids and my husband for the things that I might have done that I probably shouldn't have done. Taking a moment to kind of catalog some things that I needed to let go before I even went to bed so that I could rest well and be ready for the next day. So when you're going through a transition, understand that those dark places are not wasted. They're a time of grieving, a time of forgiving so that it doesn't root into bitterness, and a time of resting before you enter into a new season. Because the second you enter into that new season, it's going to be like, let's go. So enjoy that time of rest.
Yeah, Jess, I think that's really good what you mentioned about grief, because my personality tends to lend itself like, hurry up, let's get beyond this, because I don't want to rest in this hardship. I don't want to rest in this uneasiness, and I just want to get to the next thing. But then what happens for me, it just like, it sits there, it feels like discontent, and I don't understand what's happening because like, why isn't everything going back to normal? And it's not because I haven't taken that moment to really be in that space, to feel all the feelings and figure out maybe where I misstepped, or what did I need to learn from this whole situation. So I think that's really beautiful, because as you know, we think about, like the hardships of our lives, we want to just like run past those and not learn from that. So thank you so much for sharing that.
if we hadn't taken that time to grieve and hadn't had that, we were forced to have that time to grieve. But now we know moving forward, if something like that it was to ever happen again, because transitions happen all the time. Change happens. I mean, 2020, like look at 2020. And so like when 2020 happened, I knew I needed to take that time to grieve, because if not, I was going to take that trauma and bring it into the next season. And so taking that time to grieve is a way of just leaving it behind.
One of the questions I love, and I like to share this with a lot of people, is if we had an eraser and we could go back and erase parts of our lives, would you go back and do that? Or do you think because of those parts you desperately want to erase, that has made you into who the woman you are today?
If I didn't have that story, I wouldn't be who I am. I would still be disillusioned. I miss the bright-eyed and bushy-tailed version of myself. You know, that 7-year-old who like all I have to do is go talk to talk to my friends on the playground and tell them about Jesus. But I feel like even the transition that we went through, leaving that church and getting to where we are now, I grew up. I kind of matured a little bit. And again, I started asking the right questions, making myself better, challenging systems that are not good for the church, so that we can be better for our people. And so no, I don't regret it. I don't want to erase it. And like I said, we were very fortunate to still have some closure and that story be redeemed. But I don't think, even if it was, I don't think I'd want it erased. I think we learned a lot through that situation.
So how have you seen this shift for you, and how you've learned from this change in your marriage or your parenting?
So when I started doing the Finding Morning Glory project, one of the things that I did was create morning routines that were positive for my family. So the first one, and this is the next piece of advice that I would give anybody who is getting ready to go through a transition or has gone through or is going through a transition now, is stop hitting snooze. That was the first thing I ever did. And small steps. That's the smallest step you could possibly take in order to have a better morning, which means stop waiting for life to happen to you and take control of a tiny piece of it. So for me, it was the snooze button. If I could control just the snooze button, I felt like I had a tiny piece of control of my life, because I was spiraling. I was spiraling out of control, and the dark place was just getting bigger and bigger, and it was sucking me in. And so I took that tiny little piece of control where I am in control of that snooze button. And so I stopped hitting snooze. I stopped making excuses for why I was waiting to do the things that God had called me, equipped me, prepared me to do. I stopped listening to those just statements. Oh, you're just a stay-at-home mom. Oh, you're just a teacher. Oh, you're just a woman. Oh, you're, all the just statements. Like, we got rid of those. Stop hitting snooze. Take one tiny step towards the right direction. And how that affected my family is I was ready for them in the morning instead of them being ready for me in the morning. And for 2 kids in preschool, that was all the difference. And so I started to build on top of that. Once I just that whole first month, all I did was stop hitting snooze. That was it. I didn't have any other routine. I just kind of like went with the regular flow. I was a zombie. It didn't matter. I took one tiny step, but then then I started building. And so that's when my family really started to be affected in a beautiful way. So one month I did, the morning routine was jokes at the breakfast table. And so I had jokes prepared for my kids. Hearing them laugh first thing in the morning was the best thing ever. And so they started creating jokes, and they all had to do with cows, because, it was preschool, kindergarten, first grade kids, and it's all cow jokes, like all moo, it's all knock, knock, moo. That's all it was. But they thought it was the most hilarious thing ever. Another one, when I dropped my kids off at school, I kind of likened this one to, it was around Christmas time, and I likened it to the shepherds going in and waking everybody up the next morning, telling them what they had seen the night before. I was like, they didn't come in quietly and reverently with worship songs. songs. No, they were hollering. And so when I would drop off my kids, I would roll down the window and I'd be like, I love you. And like it caught on to the teachers who were doing like car drop off, car line and it was cold and they had their coffee and their scowls on. I'd be like, you're doing great. I love you too. Like it caught on and everybody started being really excited about my car in the morning.
That's fantastic. Those car rider people, and the teachers, Jesus loved them. Well, Jess, I think that it's important to remember what you just said, that you just kept building. It wasn't this like overnight process and like this 3-step plan is going to stop your anxiety and depression and we're going to be saved. It is a complete rebuilding process. And I think that's what is helpful to know for anyone listening and even for myself, because you want that Americanized 3-step plan, but that's not what it's about. It's like different for everybody.
And that just goes perfectly into the next thing that I would tell somebody who's going through a transition, who is in that I don't know what to do next stage. Like you've started something new. Let's say that you started a new career or you just had your first child. You've done something major or you're an empty nester and you're like, now what do I do? So you start taking your baby steps and you're like, okay, I got this. I have some control. Bam, desert. It happens to everybody. The next thing you do after stop hitting snooze, you got to define your desert, because you have to know that you're not doing anything wrong. Anytime anybody starts something new, there is a dry space in between commission and completion, and that is called the desert. It happened to Moses. The second he's called, takes him up through the Red Sea, desert, in between promised land. Like Jesus gets commissioned, dunked in a baptism. This is my son in whom I'm well pleased. He doesn't go straight into his ministry. Nope. Desert, 40 days. It happens to every single person. And if you define it, then you feel like it's not like what am I doing wrong? I'm taking tiny steps and I'm going to give up now. Because here's what happens. You're walking through a desert. If you do not have a focal point on the other side of the desert, you're going to end up walking in circles. So let's just say you try to just walk in a straight line in the desert. You get shipwrecked, you get plane crashed in the desert. You're trying to walk in a straight line. If I walk in a straight line, finally I'll get out. I'm going to take one step at a time. I'm going to stop hitting snooze and I'm going to build on it and I'm going to take one step at a time. Well, if you don't have a focal point on the other side of the desert, you're going to favor whatever leg you favor your hand. So if you're right-handed, you're going to favor your right leg. If you're left-handed, you're going to favor your left leg. And if you don't have a focal point to get to the other side of the desert, you're just going to end up walking in circles. And you're going to eventually sit down and give up. So not only do you have to stop hitting snooze, you have to define the desert. What is the desert for you? And then you have to define your why on the other side that's going to get you out of the desert. Your focal point. What's your goal? What's your why? Why are you doing what you're doing? For me specifically, when I started trying to do all of these different morning routines, all of a sudden one of my kids starts teething. So I'm like, I'm going to get up 30 minutes before my kids usually do and read the Bible. All of a sudden we have a teething kid and he's like, nah. 5 o'clock's my new wake up time. All of a sudden, like you are like, oh, I'm gonna build my own business. Oh, COVID. All of a sudden, I'm gonna start my new podcast. Oh, all of a sudden, nope, Instagram's not a thing anymore. It's TikTok now. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, it's desert. Anytime you try to start something new, there's gonna be a desert portion. For me, it was my family. For me, I want to be a published author one day. Spoiler. For me, I wanted to speak on platforms and encourage women who are going through these transitionals. That's my why on the other side of the desert. So you have to define your desert and then find your focal point on the other side so that you can eventually get out.
Good. I love it. That focal point really does help because you just feel like there is just nothing. You can't hold on to anything, and giving yourself like something to grasp onto is really impactful. And I loved what you said about the commission to completion. That is good. All right, so number 4, I from our show notes, I can see, I really want to know what you mean by this. Jump on the struggle bus. Can you tell me what that is?
I love the struggle bus because in my mind, I envision like this VW bus that's like decked out with like flowers on the side, and you've got a really great playlist going, and you've got snacks But the best part about the struggle bus is that you're on the bus with other people going through the desert. And so, like, when I say jump on the struggle bus, I really mean jump on the struggle bus. Find people who are going through the same desert that you are and get on the struggle bus together and own the fact that you're struggling. Own the fact that the desert is hard. Own the fact that you fail, that you're constantly failing, because if you're not failing, you're not learning. Failure is the greatest teacher. And so one of the best stories of the struggle bus for me, because I've been in the desert for a long time. I'm trying to do great things. I'm trying to do all these wonderful things. I have goals. I have dreams. Dawn of the new season, finding morning glory. It's still a desert. I haven't got to my completion yet. It's still years, but I've ended up really enjoying the desert because of the struggle bus that I'm on with other people. And so one of the best stories of the struggle bus is that I joined a dream incubator with a few other women, and they were all doing wonderful things. One was working on her doctorate. One was building a nonprofit. One was doing a speaker circuit, like a preacher circuit. So she was coming up with her preacher package, and I was working on a book proposal. And so what ended up happening is while we were meeting, we met for 10 weeks every Friday, never missed a Friday. We were committed. The second we committed, every single one of us started going through our own personal desert. Every single one. They were all different, but every single one of us started going through a desert. I had a family member who got extremely sick. One had mouth surgery twice. She still showed up with her ice packs on. And then one was going through the same kind of church hurt that I had experienced years ago. She was experiencing it now. The other person, bless her heart, her kids and family kept getting sick. So like she would show up, but she'd have a sick kid right next to her. And like on the Zoom, she'd stay muted, and every once in a while she'd unmute, and we'd hear kids in the background sniffling and coughing. Every single one of us were on the struggle bus. And let me tell you, it was one of the sweetest times that I've ever had, because we were all trying to get through our own personal deserts, but we weren't alone. And so finding community and finding people who are going and have the same goals or have the same dreams or going in the same direction and are not afraid to admit that it's hard, which is very hard in our society, to find people that will admit that things are hard.
Jess, how did you find these ladies? Because I think when we think of like the church community, and you're right, you have to be open and willing to share. And I think for some reason there's something in our society be like, oh, if I share this, I'm going to be considered weak, or I can't do things on my own. At least maybe that's what's going through my head. But how did you find these ladies? Like, how does one find a dream incubator?
So funnily enough, I actually found them through the Women Speakers Collective.
Okay.
So for the listeners listening, the Women Speakers Collective is a collective of women speakers and communicators. We gather together monthly through the global coaching community for coaching and community. I would say that that's another struggle bus where you have a lot of women who are trying to be better communicators, and they're in the same place, and they share their struggles, and we help each other out, and we encourage each other. And so that would be another struggle bus that I was a part of. But these ladies were a part of the Women Speakers Collective, and we just met each other through Instagram, through the collective, and we're like, hey, I see that you're working on something that I'm kind of working on. Let's all get together. We'll call it a dream incubator. It was phenomenal the way it worked out. The other struggle buses that, I mean, I've been on a lot of struggle buses. There's no shortage of struggle buses. Because like sometimes your small groups at church, if you are struggling, if you want to have a better marriage, and the second you decide you want to have a better marriage and you go to start going to counseling together, all of a sudden, all the things start falling apart and things start getting hard with your marriage the second you try and make it better. Like small groups at church with other married couples who are going through the same thing, who are not afraid to admit like, hey, marriage is tough. Like that's a struggle bus. So churches are great places, like small groups at churches are great places to find your struggle bus. There are tons of communities, Facebook groups, like mommy Facebook groups. The second you're like, okay, I'm gonna try and do better with this mommy thing because I've been on autopilot for a while, and like no shame to the autopilot life because I live the autopilot life every once in a while. But the second you try and be like, okay, I'm gonna start feeding my children better. Ha! All of a sudden your kid has been eating avocado his entire life. All of a sudden he hates avocado. So like there are Facebook groups, mommy groups, like best ways to feed your kids, healthy Facebook groups. Like there are tons of struggle buses out there if you start looking for them.
That's good. Just being aware. Okay. The last one you had, rise and shine.
Let's just recap. So you're in a moment where you're like, well, now what do I do? You grieve the past season. You understand that a dawn is coming. It's not going to be all rainbows and unicorns. You got to stop hitting snooze, take some tiny steps, start building on those tiny steps. Define your desert because you know it's going to be tough and it's not your fault. It's just the way it happens. Jump on the struggle bus, find some community because you're not supposed to do life alone. Even God doesn't exist alone. So don't exist alone. Don't struggle alone. Jump on the struggle bus. We having a good time. We got a great playlist and snacks. We all struggling together. But the next one is rise and shine. And how you rise and shine is you make sure that you set your alarm for the next dawn. You set your alarm for the next season. Understand that change is going to constantly occur. You can prepare for change without living in dread. Like you can prepare for a change just like you have a savings account. You don't have a savings account because, oh my gosh, what if I lose my job? You have a savings account because it's smart to do. So it's smart to prepare for your next change, not because you're dreading it, not because you're waiting in this like world of when's the other shoe gonna drop? When's my bubble gonna pop? I don't have hope and I don't have faith. We don't live like that. We have the loving hope of Jesus. We know that everything's gonna end up okay because we love Jesus. But it's also just smart to know. This is where I said, like, when you said you're like, hey, would you wish that anything had been erased? No, because it helps me prepare for my next change. I was doing great. I had a path. I was going through the desert and everything was good. I was on the struggle bus. I was getting ready to completion, and then 2020 happened. Another change. But instead of getting paralyzed and being completely in the dark place again, I said, okay, take some time, grieve. Okay, we got another desert. I know what happens in the desert. I need people. So I found people. That's when I found the Women Speakers Collective. That's when I found my Dream Incubator. I need people. Okay, I'm going to make sure this time that if another change happens, I'm prepared mentally for it, and I have some tools that are going to help me navigate it. And that's how you will rise and shine in the next dawn.
Jess, you are really something, like in a good way. You are. I'm just like, I love talking to you today. You're just a delight. And I'm just grateful for the wisdom that you shared and just choosing to just be open about struggle, anxiety, and depression and just embracing this desert season that we all are going to have. I'm going to tell you right now, we're all going to have it. Thank you so much. If people wanted to get connected to you, how can they do that?
So they can follow me on Instagram. My Instagram handle is Jess Ledwell. It's my name. And so if you want any more information about all of the things I talked about, I have highlights of all the morning routines that I've done. I have a whole highlight about the struggle bus. I have a whole highlight about the desert. At my Instagram, I do create a lot of biblical content, a lot of poetry content. That's just encouraging. A lot of it is morning themed, and that's where you can see where my next speaking engagements are and a lot of the organizations that I work with. I do work with the Women Speakers Collective now. And so Instagram's where you can probably find most of my content. You can also find me at jessledwell.com. I have my blog there. I have blogs about what to do for your morning for each Enneagram type. Each Enneagram type has its own specific morning routine. It's great. And so, you can reach me. You can see my blog there. You can request me as a speaker there. And there's some other fun stuff. I've got playlists to go with devotionals that I've had published on YouVersion. Mother's Day's coming up, so any of you moms out there, I've got a YouVersion devotional that I'm trying to get to 25,000 because that's like a thing. Go check out I See You Mom on YouVersion. Okay, because it's a great, and I have a mom playlist that goes with it on my website. So go check it out. You're gonna love it.
Jess, well, thank you so much for the joy that you brought to this conversation today. I'm just so grateful to really get a chance to sit down and talk to you. So thank you so much. Thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me. I had fun.
Wasn't she so fun? I hope this conversation with Jess gave you some practical steps so that you can start taking in your own life so you can better prepare for the transition when change does occur in our life. And just a heads up, it's going to. So some takeaway questions to think or journal about this week, if you want to reflect more about what we discussed with Jess today, is this. Number 1, how can you stop hitting snooze on your life and remove those just statements like, I'm just a woman, I'm just a mom, I am just a 22-year-old, I'm just an empty nester, or I just never did college, things like that. And how can we remove those ideas from our internal commentator? Number 2, how can you define your desert and pick a point that you are directing yourself towards? Thank you guys so much for listening. Please go ahead and join the Parable Podcast email list. You get to hear great stories here, but this is my way of sharing some of my funny, messy, real life situations that I am learning. Just think of it as a little encouragement in your inbox only once a month. Subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts, whether it's on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, wherever, and leave a rating review. It really helps people find out about the show. If you have any questions or you want more information about today's episode, all of the show notes are available at daniellezapchenk.com. That'll do it for today. Thank you so much for spending time with me. Remember, your parable showcases that God, in His grace, He gives us the opportunity to wake up from a life unlived. We'll see you back again next week on the Parable Podcast.